Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and spending part of your evening learning about CAMBRA and how it can help your patients in your own practice. We're really excited tonight to spend some time talking about implementation and the progression of the Carifree system. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. You are all muted, so we can't hear any comments or questions verbally. Please make sure to type questions into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a few minutes to answer questions. We will do our best to get through as many as we can. Any questions we don't have time for will be addressed via email, and we also offer one-on-one webinars for practices interested in learning more. And lastly, you should have received an email with a webinar handout to help you define your CAMBRA protocol. If you don't have the handout, you can find it online by going to carifree.com. On the dentist side of the website, go to Learn, Webinars, and click on Webinar Schedule. From there, you can download a copy of the handout. And with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Kim Cooch, CEO and founder of Oral Biotech and the Carifree system. Dr. Cooch has been successfully practicing dentistry for over 30 years, still practicing 3 days a week here in Albany, Oregon. He has a huge vision for curing dental caries, motivating him to start this company, and it continues to motivate him in the research he's leading to improve caries diagnosis and treatment. He has a lot of passion for what he does, and it's always great to hear him speak. So with that, Dr. Cooch, take it away.
All right. Hey, thank you so much, and thank everybody for being online with us tonight. We've got a lot of material to cover. This is the second part in this 3-part series here on implementation of CAMBRA. Last week, we basically covered the risk assessment forms, and tonight we've got a number of questions on that handout that we're going to try and get through. So I'm going to move right along through the material tonight. One thing I wanted to start with tonight, you know, Obamacare is a debacle, and it's painful to watch all the things that are going on with it right at the moment. Certainly as dentists, you know, we've been kind of left out of the loop on this national health care movement, with the exception of individuals that have children 19 years and younger. They need to provide dental insurance for their children. That's going to be a required part of Obamacare. But we may be impacted, and I bring this up to your attention, and I always like to, when I hear things that I think are significant, that I think that you need to be made aware of. You know, we really need to think about Obamacare proofing our practices, because one of the things that we're hearing from major employers around the country is that as the cost of medical insurance increases, one of their, I guess, options that they're looking at is to completely drop dental benefits as a way to continue to be able to afford to provide the required by law medical insurance. So I looked up this data, and I thought it was quite interesting. I shared this with a group in San Diego last week. In the United States, and I was surprised, 57% of people have dental insurance. I figured it was probably closer to 50%. Of those with dental insurance, 81% of them see the dentist twice a year. 34% of the uninsured, or the 43% that don't have insurance, 34% of them see the dentist 2 times a year. And the number one reason cited for why they don't go to the dentist is, number one, is lack of insurance, and number 2 is it's expensive. So having lived through this in Albany, Oregon, about 15 years ago, one of our major employers here, the company sold. The new company came in with an entire new set of benefits. The union basically went out on strike, and they lost their jobs, and that was about 15% of my patients in my practice. And so to take a hit like that, of having all of a sudden all of my patients that had insurance, a few hundred families, suddenly no longer have dental benefits, and I can tell you they didn't come in twice a year for their checkups, and they, you know, postponed and delayed any treatment that they could. So I think if we see that, you know, 81% of our, you know, insured patients get moved from that pool into a pool in the next couple of years because of Obamacare, that's something I think we as a group, as a profession, need to be prepared for, because so many of us are in the profession, I think, are somewhat dependent upon, or we become accustomed to, both our patients and our practices, to having that dental insurance, that third-party benefit. And I'll be talking about this more after the first of the year, because I have some really exciting ideas on how to handle that and how to prepare yourself for that. But I just wanted to share that with you tonight. You know, one of the things that's happened during the last 5 years of, of the recession that we've had in the United States is my practice has continued to grow in Lynn County, where we currently have an unemployment rate of almost 12% still. And 1 out of every 4 people are actually on food stamps in Lynn County here. So to have a practice that's continuing to grow significantly during this period of time, I really attribute to what do I do different than other practices. The main thing that I do differently is Caries risk assessment. I go through this with patients. I help them get to the root cause of their disease, and created a wellness program where we're actually helping them achieve health and wellness again. So I think that's one of the things that you're going to see as a growing trend, that patients are going to want this kind of care. So we talked about last week about the why, and then we started with why. Why do you want to do this? And then we went through the risk assessment forms pretty much in detail last week. I just want to, for the people that weren't able to attend that webinar, we went through those. We looked at the ADA form, the CDA form, the American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry, and then the Carifree form. And then at the end of that, on your handout, I just had you pick one. Decide which one you want to use and circle it. So this is really an exercise in these 3 webinars of actually taking you through the steps. These are all the decisions that I could possibly come up with in the decision tree of what do you need to know to be able to map this out in from a practice management standpoint in your practice. So we're moving on tonight. Number 2, the big question is, where are you going to collect the patient's information? And I think we discussed this a little bit last week. But are you going to do it, send it to them, have them fill it out, bring it in? Are you going to have them fill it out in the waiting room? Are you going to have it done interview style with your hygienist? And that's, where do you want to have that accomplished? And I would tell you that I started doing this 12, 13 years ago in the operatory, and I had the hygienist interviewing the patient and filling out that risk assessment form, or I would do that if I had time in the hygiene operatory. It would take probably 10-plus minutes, and quite frankly, we don't have that kind of time. There's a capacity problem already with our hygiene appointments, so we really don't have that kind of time. So we moved to probably 5 years ago, changing how we approach this, thinking outside the box, and having patients self-report their risk factors and filling that out either at the front. My front desk person either gives them a form to fill out, or we send it to them and have them bring it in filled out. And of course, people always forget their form, but certainly they can fill out another one. It just takes them a few minutes, and then by the time we get to the hygiene operatory, they're expecting us to talk about it because they filled it out, and they've identified problems that they think they have, which is significantly different than me trying to convince them they have a problem that they don't perceive. So those 2 changes really dramatically improve the success of this in my practice. So I would tell you that, think about where are you going to collect the information and how you're going to do that. And I really don't care. I'm going to go back here for just a second. I really don't care how you do it. I have practices that I know do it any one of those 3 different methods. I do it, primarily A or B. I want that filled out before they get back, to the hygiene operatory or to my operatory. When they fill out the rest of the forms, I want that filled out as well. But again, this is literally up to you, how you want to practice. So I just want you to pick one of those and circle that on your handout. The next question, the major decision in my mind, is which patients are you going to assess? Now, and I would tell you there's a wide variation of people, in who they pick to assess, and I think that it's really critical. If assessment, really, this is an assessment, and if you're just going to pick people that you already know that are high or extreme risk for dental caries, you're not really doing an assessment. You're not really doing a risk assessment for the population of your patients. You're just maybe taking and trying to identify those patients that you see as high risk and then trying to figure out what's causing their disease. That's a valuable and certainly a valid thing to do, But my real belief in the risk assessment is to identify those patients who are high risk that we don't know are high risk. You know, those patients that are at risk for getting cavities that maybe don't have any cavities right at the moment, maybe have a dry mouth or have some other issues going on that they're not really aware of. And all too often, I mean, I had a patient come in recently that she's been placed on some antidepressants and what have you, and her psychiatrist told her to suck on lemon drops. You know, so she's got a dry mouth and she's got a problem, and then the psychiatrist says, here, go treat that with lemon drops. Well, you know, that's a recipe for disaster, and so fortunately, she'd only been doing that for about 2 months and didn't have any lesions yet, but I got the opportunity in this risk assessment to talk about that. And had we not, she didn't have any cavities, and had we not gone through the risk assessment, I would have totally missed that until she came in with, you know, God only knows how many cavities that she might have had before we finally identified that. So the real value in risk assessment in my mind is to assess your entire practice. Now, whether you do that out of the gate, like if you walk out and jump into the deep end of the pool and figure out how to swim, or whether you want to just tippy-toe into the shallow end of the pool and just identify those extreme or high-risk patients, the people that you've got in your practice that are a problem for you. You know they come in with cavities every 6 months. You kind of tear your hair out. They're frustrated. You're frustrated. You're not sure what to do with them. We all have those patients. You know, if you want to just start with those, I say start with that. I mean, I don't care, again, the same kind of thing. I don't care how you do this, whether you start with just new patients. You know, new patients don't know what to expect, right? So it's not like you're changing suddenly the entire, you know, atmosphere in your practice. It's all new to them. So, you know, one way to start with this is just pick new patients and just start caries risk assessing them for a period of time until your practice gets comfortable with the whole process of risk assessment. Or you may just do the hand select, the high-risk patients, and I know a number of practices that do that. Or you could, you know, jump into the deep end of the pool and do all of your patients. And I would recommend doing a risk assessment on every patient in your practice at least once a year. There are going to be some benefits for wanting to do that as well, and we'll get into that in just a minute also. But again, it's more important to me, I don't care whether you get into the deep end of the pool or the shallow end of the pool, it's more important to me that you get in the water. So whether you make a decision to do this, you know, A, B, C, or you know, whatever, again, that's up to you to decide. I think ultimately I would love to see you know, everybody at doing all of their patients at least once a year. I really think that's going to be a kind of a standard of practice for us if we're really going to use risk assessment. So I want you, again, this is question number 3. I want you to take a second here and just pick one. Go to your handout and, you know, pick one of those that you're going to commit to, this is how I'm going to implement this in my practice. Here's who I'm going to start with. I'll give you a second here to think about that. And you may want to listen to the recording over and spend a little more time, or you may want to spend time with your team trying to figure out, you know, how are we going to, you know, from a systems and management standpoint, how do we want to implement this? The next question is, how much are you going to charge for the risk assessment, you know? And the reason that I bring this up is that up until this last year, I have not been charging separately for the caries risk assessment form. And I just included it in my fees, my exam fees and prophy fees, and it just became part of, like, they fill out their, I didn't charge for, you know, them to fill out a medical history and have me look at it. But the fact of the matter is this does add time. I think that it's extremely valuable in terms of building a relationship with the patient and getting to the correct diagnosis and figuring out how you're going to go about creating the right treatment strategy for the patient so that they can be, you know, getting control of their health. But how much are you going to charge for that? And there you've got options. And number one, you can just do it for free. Number two, you can figure out that you include it in the exam fee. You might want to increase your exam fee to cover that. Or, you know, C, you can have a separate fee. Now, the reason that I bring this up for you is that we have new CDT codes for 2014. I actually had the opportunity to help participate in creating those. And so we have C codes now for caries risk assessment, and I'm going to go through those in just a second with you. And I would tell you that one of the Delta Insurance branches participants, it's in Massachusetts, that I have worked with and consulted with for probably 5 years now, are going to, they've already created a plan for their employers there where they believe so strongly in Caries risk assessment that they're going to reimburse $50 for every risk assessment form that was filled out and submitted to them. I mean, they believe that this is going to provide so much better treatment outcomes and overall reduce the ongoing cost of care for patients, helping get them healthy, focusing on this as a philosophy, that they're putting their money behind it. So when I said to you before, who are you going to do risk assessment on, I don't know how many patients you have in your practice and how frequently they typically come in, but if you have 1,200 patients in your practice and you see them once and you do a risk assessment on them once a year, which I think is appropriate, that's $60,000 in revenue. So I mean, that's a significant, people always want to ask, well, how do I make this pay for itself? How do I do this? How do I work out the financial model so I can afford to do this and help my patients? That's a big chunk right there. That's a $60,000 increase in your revenue just for filling out this form every year. So that's why I brought that up before. And obviously in your area, in my area, I'm not anticipating that I'm going to have insurance products or plans for my patients that are going to necessarily reimburse for this right away. But I'm going to talk to the employers in the area, and we're going to try and convince them that this is a product, and the insurance companies, this is a product, this is an important thing, and they should be looking at it. And I think, so this may not happen tomorrow or January 1 in your area, but you might be surprised. Like, you might actually send out a few forms and to collect to the insurance company, submit for payment, and find out that you may have patients that actually have this coverage. So that's something that I would encourage you to start looking at, particularly that those new fee codes come in effect January 1. So again, we're at a decision point. How much will you charge? Is it going to be free, including your exam? Is it a separate fee? If you want to create a new fee for your practice and build insurance and use that CDT code. Now, one thing about it, even though they don't have coverage in their particular or specific plan, doesn't mean you can't charge for it, file that fee code with the insurance company, and the patient needs, obviously is responsible for the balance of whatever that their insurance company doesn't pay for. So it doesn't mean that you can't establish that fee. And I believe at this point in time, I don't think we're violating any FTC regulations here, but I think probably a ballpark fee for a procedure like that, because it's new, I would say $50 is a pretty fair fee. So I want you, again, just take a second here and pick one. The next thing I want to talk about tonight, and this is the next really big step, that pretty much covers the risk assessment form. What I really want to get into next is biometrics. Like, are you going to use a biometric? And I can tell you advantages for doing that. I can tell you the disadvantages for not doing it. But using a biometric gives you an opportunity to have some sense of where the disease activity level is in the patient, aside from just looking at the end result of the disease, which is cavities. If you're looking just for signs, that doesn't really give you a feel for kind of what their baseline is. So my whole point in having a biometric is I want to know what's going on in the patient's mouth, because that may be something when we talk about trying to get down to what are the actual causes driving their disease. Is it a bacterial issue? I think most of you have probably heard me talk about the usual suspects. And in that, I'm looking at, if it's bacterial, primarily a bacterial suspect that's driving this disease. Is it a dietary issue? Is it a salivary issue? Or do I suspect, in the absence of any of those three, could it be a genetic problem? So it's really helpful to have a kind of a measurement that's that you can look at to determine whether or not you actually feel that this is a bacterial problem. Obviously, if you see heavy plaque caked on the teeth, you have a bacterial issue, but then you've got to make a decision on, how active is that bacteria. So when I started this 12 years ago, I was doing cultures, and let's start with that. We'll start there. I used the CRT Bacteria Culture kit. I bought an oven. I still have a culture oven. When I do research, now I do kind of DNA checkerboarding. But, on the biofilms, I'm looking at, about 500 different bacteria in the mouth. But so I still have a culture oven in my my lab and my research lab in my office, that may or may not be something that you want. It costs I looked these up, got them out of the Patterson catalog, $117.50 for 6 tests. It works out to $19.58 per test. It cultures both Mutans, Streptococci, and Lactobacillus. Basically, you get a sample of their saliva. If you've never done this, there's little pieces of paraffin wax there they chew on for 5 minutes and spit in a cup. You take that and it's got a little auger tube that has 2 sides to it. One side selecting medium for Mutans, Streptococci, and the other side selects for Lactobacillus. Requires an oven. Ovens are about $200. It takes 48 hours to incubate, and you kind of want to read it at 48 hours. I mean, maybe if it was 72 hours, it's not, a huge problem, but to standardize your measurements, you want to do that. What I found was the inconvenience for this was just managerially in my practice, it was really challenging. Taking a sample, having to incubate it for 2 days, and then calling, typically I'm working with a kid or I'm working with a patient, a soccer mom. It's like then trying to call them up and get them back 2 days later to talk about the results or talk about the results over the phone. Or, I don't practice on Fridays. Taking a culture on Wednesday, it needed to be read on Friday. Waiting till Monday is a little bit too long. So just from a practice management standpoint, this was problematic for me. And looking at that, it doesn't correlate well. Most of the test kits that are on the market, and there's actually a couple of these that you can find that culture mutant, particularly for Mutans, Streptococci. One of the challenges is they don't really correlate well to the actual levels of Mutans, Streptococci. So it's not very strongly predictive. When you start taking a look at that, how significant is the result I got, and how can I take that data and make it meaningful in my diagnosis? So that's a challenge. One of the things that's been kicked around for years, certainly like a pregnancy test, is a monoclonal antibody test for Mutans, Streptococci. And this is developed by GC. It's available here in the U.S. It's $181.95 per 10 tests, which works out to about $18 a test. Again, if you're going to use these tests at $18 a whack or $19 a piece, that's something you're going to want to charge for. And we'll talk about the fee codes associated with that, and you will probably find a good number of your patients probably have coverage for this kind of testing. This correlates this correlates just to Mutans, Streptococci if there's more than 5 times 10 to the 5th colony-forming units per milliliter of saliva, and that basically is kind of the cutoff point for being high risk with Mutans, Streptococci or low risk. And it takes 12 steps, and it takes about 15 minutes to perform this test, mixing all of the ingredients and running it. But it's chairside, and it only takes like 15 minutes, say, versus 2 days. So that's an improvement. The monoclonal antibody test accurately and rapidly predicts or determines the mutant abundance in saliva, and it could be useful for chairside assessment of children's caries risk in this one study that was published last year. I've seen reports that said it wasn't that predictive, but again, it's a test that if you wanted to use, it's available. One of the other tests, this has just come out. In fact, it's not available yet in the United States. It's available currently in Europe. And so I guessed on, because it's an monoclonal antibody test, I guessed on pricing. I'm going to assume it's about the same price. And this is a salivary IgA test for Mutans, Streptococci. So it's the immune globulin A in the saliva, which would represent, kind of correlate then to, you have high levels of, salivary IgA antibody levels, you probably have high levels of Mutans, Streptococci in the mouth. Again, it's the same process. It takes 12 steps, and it takes about 15 minutes. Again, it's not available yet, but I bring it up because some of the research people have been combining both of those tests to examine their patients and try and get kind of an accurate feel on what their Mutans, streptococcal levels are. So this actually found, this is one of those reports. This was just published in October. Compared the Carigram data, which is a caries risk assessment form from Sweden, and then they looked at it. They used both kits in this together and found that it had a pretty good correlation rate. Let's see, the combined sensitivity and specificity here is 162%. you know, and 160% is pretty much our gold standard for sensitivity, combined sensitivity and specificity. So combining those two tests, you know, so you're running at a cost of about $36 and you're going to spend about 30 minutes doing it, gives you pretty good predictive data to work with. And then the last biometric in my mind that's available on the market is the CariScreen meter. This is an ATP bioluminescence. One of the things that after I cultured for a couple of years and I didn't really see a very strong correlation between the bacterial levels that I was culturing and what I saw in terms of caries activity in the mouth, I thought, I started looking at the biofilm model, and also there was, about that point in time, there was a lot of research coming out that there was more than just Mutans, Streptococci, and lactobacillus that were disease or pathogenic bacteria, contributing to this disease. In fact, now we've identified over 50 of those. And so this is truly a biofilm disease. We know that about 40% of the kids in the United States that are high risk for dental caries don't have any Mutans, Streptococci. So, I started looking for a broad spectrum test. I wanted to look at just the entire biofilm level in the mouth, and something that was fast. And this turned out to be, this takes a couple of minutes. It literally takes 15 seconds after you, take the swab across, run across the 6 teeth. It works out to $5.90 per test. So this is immediate and chairside, and it correlates in the scientific studies that we've done, correlates the total bacterial load, and it correlates also the Mutans, Streptococci level specifically. And in another study, it correlated to the caries risk. So there have been a number of studies done, independent studies done at universities around the globe at this point in time using this meter, and it's something that I feel very comfortable with recommending. This is one of the studies that we did at OHSU. Was published back in 2009. So again, it's not measuring specifically for Mutans, Streptococci. It's actually looking at all the bacteria. One of the things that we know about these cariogenic acid uric bacteria is that they use a high level of ATP, and so this is really an identifying marker for them, and so it becomes a good biomarker, and it's rapid, and it is predictive, and it is it's less expensive than the other tests. So if you're going to use, this is number 5 on the list tonight. If you're going to use a biometric test, you've really got 3 options, or 4 options. I mean, one of your options is not to use anything at all. But number 1 is using cultures. I would recommend the CRT culture by Vivanet. If you wanted to look just for, you want to look for Mutans, Streptococci, but you don't want to culture, you've got the saliva check Mutans test from GC. And if you want to look at a broad spectrum at the biofilm activity level, you've got the CariScreen meter. So, and then one of the last things is, you could certainly choose not to use a biometric. I think hopefully I've kind of made myself clear, and I think the advantages of having a biometric gives you a baseline, particularly as you go through any therapeutic strategies to kind of determine, are we making improvements? If you don't have a biometric, what's your endpoint? If your endpoint is, do they get another cavity in a year or not? I guess that's how we pretty much practice. That's how I practiced for the first 20 years of my career, and I'm not willing to do that any longer. My endpoint is not that if my heart medication is working, is whether the patient had another heart attack. I would rather have some sense of a metric. So let's take a minute, and you can decide, and particularly like you take a patient like this, obviously they have a bacterial problem. You see all that plaque on their teeth. I kind of want to know, in addition to the fact they've got a high bacterial load, is there a lot of activity and a lot of ATP there? So that is question number 5. Go to your form, make a decision on whether or not you want to use a biometric, and pick one. Moving right along. Will this testing be part of the exam, or are you going to charge a separate additional fee for the testing? Now, I use the Carifree form, and I've got 2 different versions of that. The one on the left, would you like a free bacterial screening today to help test whether or not you're at risk for decay? And the one on the right is, would you like a bacterial screening test, because there is a CDT code for this. So I think that's one of the things that you need to make a decision on, and I can tell you that I have done it both ways. And I started by charging for it. I was surprised in my community to find out probably almost 40% of my patients actually have coverage for that. So you could charge a fee depending upon what test you're using. I create a fee that's appropriate so that you are profitable and not losing money by performing the task. But I started by using it or charging a separate fee. And I would tell you that I feel so strongly about having a biometric, and I feel so handicapped when I don't have it, that I charged $10 for it, and I was using the CariScreen meter. So I wasn't charging. That's not a high. In my mind, that was like a non-event. I couldn't imagine going to a physician and having them say I could take this test that would give me a really good feel for whether or not you're at risk for this serious, it's the #1 disease in the world. It costs $10. You may or may not have insurance coverage for it. And my patients would say, oh, if my insurance is covered, I don't want it, for $10. And so it's like I got so tired of arguing with patients that I finally raised my prophy fee by $10, and now I just do it at will. I still send a statement out for that to the insurance companies, because if we don't use the codes get abandoned after a while. So we have to show activity on the code. If they have coverage, that's great. We credit the patient. If they don't have coverage, we write it off. But I want the insurance company to know that that's an important code. They should create products and continue to create products that use that. So, is it free? Do you want to do it for free, or do you just want to raise your fee? Make it part of your exam fee, make it part of your prophy fee, charge a separate fee, or not charge at all. Just do it and not charge for it. I think I would say that's a mistake. But so I'd encourage you to do A, B, or C. And I started with C, and now I do B. So I'll share that information with you. So at this point in time, again, this is kind of a decision point. Pull out your handout and make a decision on this. Are you going to use a biometric? And if you are, how are you going to charge for it? You know what they cost. You know how long they take, and you can determine, whether or not that's important to you and to your patients. So I want you to pick one. Now, headed down the path of we're going to do that, who's going to perform the test? Is that something that you're going to do? Are you expecting your hygienist to do it? Are you going to have an assistant do it? Literally, I think you could do it at the front. I mean, this is something you could literally do at the front desk. It's not invasive, but you've got the option of, is the doctor going to do it? Is the hygienist going to do it, or the assistant primarily? And it's the first thing that needs to be done. You don't want to disturb the biofilm. Whether you're doing if you're using ATP, it's the first, you want to put the bib on the patient and swab the teeth. And typically, if I'm doing it or my hygienist is doing it, typically we turn the meter on. It takes 60 seconds to warm up and calibrate. So I walk in, the patient is seated, the bib goes on, and we swab their teeth, and it goes into the meter. So literally, pretty much before we've had a hi, hello, how are you, we've already, pulled up our biometric. In my practice, that's the hygienist that does that. I screen patients once a year, so they both get a form filled out once a year for all patients, and they get an ATP swab once a year as well. So, and my hygienist does that. Now, when I'm doing a follow-up on patients, I may test them in 3 months. I'm doing it's an extremist patient. We're restoring a lot of lesions. I've got them on chemotherapy. I've got a bunch of things that we're doing at the same time. 3 months down the road, I may test them myself, and either my assistant or I will perform that test, and I may test them at 6 months. So it's something that they're certainly going to get it once a year from the hygienist, and depending upon where they fall in that, in terms of their disease activity and their needs and requirements, they may get tested more than once. So again, I want you to take a second and figure out it should be starting to kind of come together for you in your mind of like where the form gets filled out, who's doing that, where's that happening, who's evaluating it, and where do you want the test done. So this all gets done, happens in my hygiene officers for the most part. Now, the next step in the process after testing, if you're going to use a metric, is diagnosis. And the process for diagnosis is different depending upon which form you use. The ADA form gives you weighted values, which haven't been validated, by the way, but if you want to assign numeric numbers and then go add them up and then decide whether the patient is low, moderate, or high risk. The CDA form, has a balance, John Featherstone's balance, the teeter-totter at the bottom of the page. This form that we use, we just basically picked a grid and looked at risk factors, disease indicators, and then if you're using a biometric, and then just plug that in. Are they a concern? I wanted people to have the time to do some critical thinking. It's just not an automatic check. It gets 10 points. I want to know, is that a real problem? Are you concerned about it or not? Because there are some patients that, I may not be concerned about. They may have a risk factor. They may be a mouth breather. They may have a little dry mouth at night, but they haven't had a cavity in the last 30 years. They're not taking any medications in absence of any other, and they've got a low biometric reading. They don't have any other risk factors. If we were just doing a risk form and we checked yes and that made them high risk or moderate risk if they had a risk factor, that's what we'd end up with. And the fact of the matter is, that's me, right? I'm a mouth breather, and so I would be moderate risk, and I haven't had a cavity in almost 40 years. So I'm not worried about that. So if there's an example of somebody that has one risk factor, but in my mind, that's not a concern. The disease indicators are concerned. The number one disease indicator, when we did a survey of about 8,500 patients in 5-6 different practices, we did that large study last year. Well, we found the number one by survey, by these private practices, the number one disease indicator was that the patient had had a filling in the previous 3 years. Well, what does that mean? Well, if they had 20 cavities, large new lesions last year, and they had them filled, yeah, that's a concern. If they had a filling done 3 years ago, they haven't had a cavity in, again, 20 years, they think maybe they're not sure why they had it. In my mind, maybe it could have been a broken restoration that they just had to replace because they had mechanical failure. That's not a risk for dental caries in my mind, so that's not a concern. So I think, it's great to have all of these boxes and checklists and everything, but we still need to apply critical thinking. And so that's a real important part here. And the biofilm challenge, if it's high, typically that's a concern to me. But again, I want you to, use your gray matter and make that decision. And then those things just plug into this little grid, and they're low risk, moderate, high risk, and extreme risk based on how they profile out. So that's the Carifree form, and that's if they have no risk factors, no disease indicators, and a low biofilm challenge. So it's like no, and you're not concerned about them. They're low risk. In our study that we did, that turned out to be 3% of our patients across 6 different practices. If you have one risk factor based on the definition of the ADA, that person is at moderate risk. So if they have a risk factor you're concerned about, in my mind, that makes them moderate risk. If they have disease indicators, they have the disease. And so it's like, or if they have a high biofilm challenge and risk factors you're concerned about, they have the disease, that makes them at least high risk. And when you check yes to all those boxes, you've got an extreme risk patient in my mind that has high activity of their disease. So the real question I want you to think about are the risk factors or are the disease indicators, are those things a concern to me? Now the ADA, Council on Scientific Affairs, came out with this guideline. They published it in August 2006 in a special supplement of JADA. It was on fluoride treatment, in the dental practice, and recommendations. And in the middle of that, they had this guide for definitions of these different categories. And basically, if you have no incipient lesion, cavitated primary or secondary lesions in the past 3 years, and you have no risk factors, that person is low risk. And I would tell you there aren't many patients in your practice that meet that criteria. If they have at least one risk factor, which almost everybody does, that makes them at least moderate risk for dental caries. And then they started on, was it more than one lesion in the past 3 years? And if you go down the list of the high caries risk, that older than 6 years of age, do they have three or more lesions in the last 3 years? And one of the things you're starting to see is that insurance companies as well are starting to make criteria based on, do they have 1 or more lesions, or is it 2 or more? For us, it's 3 or more. So you're starting to see some, I guess some diversity from this original chart, but so you're going to have insurance companies in your practice are going to create their own guidelines, but basically you're going to need to make a diagnosis of low, moderate, or high risk, and which diagnosis will you use? How do you want to go about that? You're going to have to make a decision on those guidelines. You can't go wrong following the ADA guidelines. I think the Carifree guidelines in that form pretty well follow the ADA guidelines, but you're going to have the wrench in the works is going to be you may have an insurance company that you've got a patient that had a new cavity last year, and the insurance company may define high risk by they needed 3 cavities in the last 12 months. There isn't any continuity right at the moment, but I think that will come over time. But again, I just want you to pick one. Now, these are the new codes that I talked about just a little bit earlier. So we've got 3 codes for caries risk assessment, the DO 601, 602, and 603. Caries risk assessment and documentation, that means a form, with a finding of low risk, moderate risk, or high risk using recognized assessment tools. So I would tell you the 4 risk assessment forms that I shared with you in my mind are recognized assessment tools, and I would tell you that the biometrics that I shared with you are all recognized assessment tools as well. But these are new, and this is the one that the first company that's coming out is going to be reimbursing at $50, and that's a Delta plan in Massachusetts. Now, you don't need to pick one of these, but for each patient, you're going to need to pick one. So this is, you're going to be using those fee codes. So don't get misled by this. You don't need to circle one of those, but you will for the individual patient. That takes us to the next step in the process, which is treatment. This is Edwina Kidd, one of my mentors. I love this lady. She's retired now. She's probably one of the greatest cariologists in the world, respected and revered by everybody, and she's a no-nonsense person. If she knows the answer, she tells me. If she doesn't, she says, I don't know. And if she thinks I have a great idea, she tells me, and if she thinks I don't, she tells me that as well. So I really value people in my life that are truth tellers. And I love this paper. This was just out in May. Control of the biofilm is treatment of caries. The lesion is not, treating the lesion is not treatment of dental caries. That's treating a lesion. It's restoring teeth. Control of the biofilm is the treatment of caries. So what we need to figure out is what's going on in the mouth and try and figure out how to sort that out. So what I really want to talk about is caries treatment. So one of the things that we've done at Carifree is tried to identify, well, what strategies are valid and have at least enough scientific evidence that we feel comfortable providing those. And I think fluoride certainly is one that, that's number one. We have the greatest scientific evidence on fluoride. Advantages, disadvantages, certainly philosophical debates. We can get into all of that, but, fluoride certainly have an abundance of scientific evidence on. We also have a tremendous amount, and I'm not going to get into pit and fissure sealants, but there's an abundance of evidence on pit and fissure sealants. So between pit and fissure sealants, universally on teeth, depending upon whether you want to use glass ionomer or resin-based and maintain them every 6 months. But certainly, pit and fissure sealants are indicated on patients on posterior teeth, and fluoride in some capacity, I think, are probably the 2 things that we have the greatest amount of evidence on. Next up is probably an antimicrobial agent, and we're going to talk about those here in a few seconds. Xylitol, I would probably place 3rd here. I know that there was a study out. I'm going to share that with you here tonight. And also, you need to see the second part of that study, which most people have not seen. And then we get into, calcium phosphate, how you might utilize that in terms of remineralization on your caries patients. And then pH neutralization is something that has been proposed for a long time. It seems to be very logical based on the work that was done by Phil Marsh way back in the 1980s. But we hear a lot of people now starting to talk about neutralization as well, and that's really where Doug Young and I started our focus, 11, 12 years ago, looking at pH and fluoride. Now, one of the always categories for your high-risk patients is going to be fluoride varnish, and if they're moderate to high risk, you can apply that every 3 months, and there are CDT codes for that. And I'm going to give you the entire list of CDT codes that we use for basically for Caries therapeutic strategies. But a fluoride varnish isn't always, and that's every 3 months. So you can, there are a number of those on the market. This one has xylitol in it as well. This is the, if you look at the Cochrane research, this is a report based on the Cochrane database, and the conclusion is still the same, to suggest a substantial caries inhibiting effect of fluoride varnish in both permanent primary teeth. Now, one of the challenges is that we've got in all of our evidence when we start looking at systematic reviews of random controlled trials is that, you know, there's a lot of maybe some bias, high-risk bias within the studies and heterogeneity of the patients that we're studying. Like we'll take a population of high-risk patients and study them. So, you know, there's quality evidence is certainly is moderate, but we have an abundance of it. So I think that fluoride certainly has to be one of our primary go-to weapons here. You also have 5,000 parts per million fluoride gels. There's a number of those on the market, and good scientific evidence around, you know, 5,000 parts per million gels. We also have fluoride 0.05% rinses. The main difference in these rinses is the Carifree rinse in the center is a pH of 8.0. One of the things we're trying to do with all of those products and those strategies is create combined strategies where they're saturated with xylitol. They have 0.05% fluoride, and they also have an elevated pH that matches the, you know, nature, you know, stimulated saliva. Antimicrobial agents. There are 3 that I can name for you to use to treat, you know, biofilms in the mouth. You've got chlorhexidine, which has been kind of a gold standard for us for forever. You've got povidone iodine, betadine, basically 10% solution. I use that. I used that as a rinse for about 1.5 years in my practice. I started with chlorhexidine, was not particularly pleased with the results that I saw. It did a great job on the Mutans Streptococci. I was culturing at the time. It does not affect lactobacillus. And so one of the things, you can't use it at the same time as fluoride. One is cationic, the other is anionic. So that represented a challenge in my mind. So I stopped using chlorhexidine. I went to betadine. And betadine is very problematic. It works well. The scientific data is very supportive in children. On adults, it doesn't seem to have a very good effect. I can't tell you why that is. I can only tell you that that's the data. And Doug Young did quite a bit of research with that down at UOP in the early, 2001, 2002. The problem with betadine is that it stains everything. You can only use it once a month, and anybody that has a shellfish allergy, obviously you don't want to use the iodine with, so that's an issue. So one of the things that Doug and I looked at is I want to know, I basically went to Jorgen Slotz's research at USC in periodontics, and you know, in his mind, sodium hypochlorite is the best antimicrobial agent that we've got. You know, the difficulty with that is that it tastes bad. And it's only stable by itself. You can't mix it with anything and have any stability out of it. So you have to mix it and use it every time you want to use an increment. So, but I started using sodium hypochlorite, and it actually did a great job at reducing the biofilm load in the mouth. Of course, obviously, you'll see inflammation, a lot of other things, including candidiasis clear up from it, but it really reduces the bacterial load in the mouth. And then this paper came out 2 years ago from JADA, 88th Council of Scientific Affairs. They looked at non-fluoride caries-preventive agents. And one of the things they looked at was chlorhexidine, and they found that xylitol chewing gum had weak evidence in children over the age of 5. Expert opinions favored it for all ages. Chlorhexidine thymol varnish every 3 months seemed to be there was some evidence supporting that for root surface lesions, class 5 lesions, particularly in senior citizens. And their recommendation, and this was in red letters, all other chlorhexidine in any form for any lesion site for any age is not recommended in bold red letters. Now, I think that's probably a little strong. I know John Featherstone has some research that shows some efficiency with chlorhexidine. But again, this is the 88th Council of Scientific Affairs, and I certainly have converted my entire practice a long time ago to sodium hypochlorite. So the conclusions from the study is it's certain non-fluoride agents may provide benefit. in children and adults at higher risk of developing dental caries, but they did not recommend chlorhexidine. So I'm just sharing that information with you here tonight. Again, so looking at the data, this came from, again, Jorgen Slotz, and looking at periodontal biofilms, but sodium hypochlorite is safe. It doesn't produce any adverse effects, doesn't create any persistent bacteria, and we've been using it for a long time. So it works really well. It has a broad spectrum of antimicrobial activity, and it kills bacteria basically on contact. So that works really well. We did a clinical trial in Australia. Carrot Howlett was the lead researcher. This is back, this was published in 2010, the first part of that. The rest of those papers are currently in submission to be published. But we took two populations of mixed dentition, grade school, high-risk grade school populations in rural Queensland, Australia, and found that the standard 0.05% fluoride rinse reduced the decay, caries index by about 29%, and the caries-free treatment rinse reduced it by 73%, just using it for a 30-second supervised rinse once a day, four times a week at school, 9 months out of the year with no other instructions were given at all. So that's pretty significant. Xylitol, I mentioned xylitol. It is an anti-caries agent. Again, you'll find a lot of people in favor of it, or a lot of believers, and you'll find a lot of non-believers. There's a lot of research that supports the use of xylitol. A lot of that comes out of Scandinavian countries. A lot of it involves chewing gum, but certainly there's a tremendous amount of research. We also know that fluoride and xylitol have synergistic effects. So one of the things that I've always tried to do, again, is kind of cluster these things together so that we're doing multiple therapies at the same time. Now, this is the study that Bader, Vollmer, and Sugars published. It was a three-site study, and they gave these 300 and some odd patients, high caries risk patients. They just gave them 5 xylitol mints a day, and what they found was at the end of the 3 years, 33 months, there made no difference whatsoever from the control group. So in January, I got more probably feedback, people emailing me, asking questions. I finally did a blog on it from this one study, because every anti-xylitol individual in the woodwork came out and said, aha, see, we told you it doesn't work. And then the second part of the study came out. And this is where they went back and did secondary analysis of their patients. And what they found was, and this was published in the Journal of Dentistry, Dental Research, rather, I'm sorry, in June of this year. And what they found was that on the patients in the xylitol arm, these were caries-active adults, reduced their incidence of root caries lesions by 40%. That shocked me. I honestly didn't expect 5 xylitol mints a day to have much of any effect at all on anybody. In the absence of any other strategies, I really didn't figure that would have any results. So to see on the patients that were caries active reduce their root surface lesion incidence by 40% is significant. So, so even in that study that, people want to point to and say, aha, see, it doesn't work. Actually, the secondary analysis of that study, it's pretty remarkable how well it worked on those patients. So it could be that it doesn't work on everybody for everything. We need to target it specifically to patients if you're going to use a single strategy. And then you've got pH strategies. This was first proposed by Philip Morris when looking at the real driving force for the selection pressure in the biofilm is not which bacteria are present, but it's actually the pH, and it's not sugar availability, it's the pH. So you're going to see more and more, I think, companies talk about a strategy of trying to neutralize the mouth, return it to health. And that's how nature deals with this disease, or how it keeps the mouth healthy. Saliva is number one in terms of protecting mechanisms. It's got, 2,260 different proteins in it. A lot of those are protective antibodies, and enzymes. But it also has a pH of 8.0. The stimulated saliva, when you start to eat, the pH goes up to like around 8. And that's how nature deals with maintaining healthy teeth. So, basically what we've tried to do is copy nature. Now, one of the things that I was not aware of, and I've mentioned this in one of my previous webinars, is, I would tell patients, if you're going to do anything else, rinse your mouth out with water, right? They always say, what do I do when I have a snack? I'm at work. I'm here. I did this. I did that. What do I do? What can I do? Well, just rinse your mouth out with water. Well, actually had a hygienist, bless her heart, thank you for that, asked me at a meeting I was lecturing in Denver in January, said, Dr. Cooch, do you know what the pH of a bottle of water is? And I'm like, well, what, 7? I mean, it's water. Well, we went right on the internet in front of the audience, and we looked it up, and I was shocked that about half of the bottled waters have a pH of around 4.0. So it's okay to tell the patient to rinse with water. Perhaps tap water would be great. Most tap water is right around 7 to 7.25, depending upon your community. Or at least they need to look up the water by brand to make sure that they're rinsing with a water that's not acidic, because I really don't think that's probably a good plan. So we know that low resting pH and low salivary flow increases dental caries, particularly in adults. And so this study was published this year in JADA. It's not rocket science. It's what you would expect, but it certainly supports our understanding in terms of this disease model. Now, remineralization, we want to talk about, if we want to add, in addition to fluoride, the best scientific evidence we had on remineralization is on fluoride. But if we want to add something, calcium phosphate, to that, the saliva is already supersaturated with fluorapatite and hydroxyapatite nanocrystals. But we also have amorphous calcium phosphate, tricalcium phosphate, casein phosphopeptides, that should be CPP, and amorphous calcium phosphate. And then we've got nanoparticles of hydroxyapatite. And this is actually an SEM, high SEM resolution of enamel rods. You can see these little crystallites, little nanoparticles. They are like the Lego building block of enamel. So Doug and I looked at, if we're going to do this, let's start with, that's how nature does it again, fluorapatite and hydroxyapatite. Why not start there? So we actually started with nanoparticles of hydroxyapatite. We did a study, a blind study with Dr. Coyce and JADA in Seattle last year, and then we published that this year in Compendium, looking at neutralization and nanohydroxyapatite and demonstrating that we saw a new layer of hydroxyapatite clustering on the surface of the artificial lesion. So when we talk about therapeutics tonight, we covered a lot of territory rapidly, but we have fluoride, pH, xylitol, remineralization, antimicrobial, and of course, in my mind, it's all of the above. Now, you may target, you've got patients that may or may not benefit from an antimicrobial agent. So real briefly, what I would tell you is that if you've got a patient that has a high biofilm load, they have a bacterial issue, that's a patient that's going to benefit from an antimicrobial agent. If you've got a patient that's high caries risk, but they have a low biofilm load, that's like giving somebody, they have a fever, but they don't have a bacterial infection. Giving them an antibiotic isn't going to make a difference. So those patients, we're trying to use that biometric not to determine whether or not they have the disease. I'm trying to figure out whether or not they have a bacterial biofilm issue as part of their disease, and that makes my decision for whether or not I'm going to use an antimicrobial agent. And I hopefully that makes sense to you. But again, so at this point in time, pull out your handout. We've got 3 main products that I use that are typically put together in kits, 3-month kits, but I've got 3 main products that I use. I don't care what products you use. I don't care how you if you want to put the kits together yourself. I don't care how you go about this. These are the kits I use. The Caries Treatment Rinse has those 4 strategies all together bundled. The CTX4 gel has those bundled together, and the CTX3 rinse has those 3 strategies bundled together. So, basically I wanted to create those like that. So the next question is, and I would tell you, I would make this recommendation to you. When I started doing this, I handed patients basically a 1-month supply. I gave them 1 bottle of chlorhexidine and 1 bottle of Vax fluoride rinse, and I put them on a 5,000 part per million gel from some manufacturer, and I sent them home. And if I didn't see the patient for 6 months, we were starting from scratch. And so what I started doing was putting together kits that had 3 months worth of product, because I wanted to recall these patients every 3 months then and start looking at them and testing them. And so you really want to send your patient, if you're going to, whatever you're going to prescribe 3 months worth. People don't have time after they run out of product in a month to come by your office. They have very busy lives. Give them 3 months worth of stuff and then recall them every 3 months. And then you can change your kit based on what you see that's happening as they progress, toward health. You may want to change what you're putting in your kit. tonight, you have 3 decisions. You can use pre-made kits, you can put together your own kits, or you can just use individual products. And again, I don't care how you do that. I don't care what products you use. I more care about the fact that you start using therapeutic strategies to treat the disease rather than seeing dental caries as a drill and fill. So take a few minutes and pick one. And I would have to tell you that I cannot believe it. I really had serious concerns that I would be able to present all this material tonight in 1 hour. And we are exactly on the hour here. I'm quite pleased. I know that I went through that fairly quickly, but I know that you made a lot of decisions, and I hope this was helpful for you. The last third segment of this, we have like 12 more decisions to make. It isn't quite so intensive with science, but I really think you need at least a 50,000-foot level of the science to kind of help you make a decision on where you want to go with this. We looked at tonight, covered the risk assessment form, who fills it out, how do you charge for it, where are the patients filling it out. We looked at, are you going to use a biometric, which one are you going to use, how are you going to charge for that. So we kind of went through and got into the therapy and the strategies, and there's like 5 main strategies in my mind. We didn't talk about probiotics yet. I'll probably be talking about that again sometime after the first of the year. But I'm looking at 5 strategies I feel that we have, good evidence to support, and then talk about putting them in kits, and getting those kits together for your patients. So we covered a lot of strategies tonight. Hopefully you feel good about it. I think, Cody, the part 3 is on Tuesday, December 10th, which is about a month from now. Same time, same station. We're going to go through the last parts of that, and I think some of those are real critical as well in terms of you being successful in implementing this. But I want to thank you all for being with me tonight. We've had tremendous feedback on this webinar series, and I guess for the first time I really understand, these are the things that I kind of worked through over a span of 12 years, and these are really the decisions you have to make. Regardless of what product or form or whatever you use, these are really the core decisions you have to make and be clear about, and have your team be clear about for you to manage this as you implement it into the systems in your practice. So again, I'm always honored when you spend time and allow me to share my experiences and my knowledge with you. So I want to thank you for being with us tonight. Cody, I think we have time for one question.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Cooch. We do have a lot of really good questions coming in, but since we are running short on time, I want to get this one great question in. The question is, if we raise our exam fee to cover the CariScreen cost, should or could we still bill out to insurance using the susceptibility code?
Okay, we're going to, that is a great question, and thank you for that. We're going to actually go through that in probably a little clearer detail in the next webinar, because we're going to go through all of the fee codes that we use. But I would tell you this, the answer to that question is yes. If you include a biometric in your exam fee, or I included it in my pro fee, raised my pro fee $10 to cover what I felt the cost of the CariScreen meter, and so I can feel comfortable doing that. You still want to, you can and you still want to bill for it to the insurance company separately using that fee code, and I think it's DO425 is the caries susceptibility test. And then, because we've got to utilize the code or we're going to lose it. And so I think as we build value and as patients get used to the process and they see the value in it, I think that'll become more part of our standard practice. But you can bill the insurance company. If the company reimburses you for it, you can either keep the money or you can refund it to the patient or credit the patient for it. If they don't, obviously cover it. At least we've let the insurance company continue to collect data that this is an important code and we want to continue to utilize it, and you can write that off for the patient. So you've got different ways that you can go about that, but certainly it's something that you want to continue to utilize that code as much as you can. So that's a great question. And I think that about wraps it up for tonight. Whatever questions that I know there are a lot of good questions coming in. We've got a great turnout here tonight, and I know you're going to have a lot of questions. Any questions that didn't get answered tonight, certainly the team at Carifree here is going to try and address those and get that out to you, and again, also send you a link to the recording of this. And Janelle, is there anything I'm missing?
Nope, yeah, but feel free to contact us with any questions. And if you would like to learn more about implementing CAMBRA into your practice, again, we do offer those complimentary one-on-one webinars, and we'd be happy to schedule one to fit into your practice's schedule.
All right, hey, well, thank you, everybody. Have a great week. Have a great Thanksgiving, and I will be back with you all in December. Everybody have a great week. Thank you. Good night.